China is moving a large number of warships toward Iran under the label of joint exercises. But this isn't a friendly visit. It isn't a routine show of force. It's a shield. Because Beijing believes Washington may be preparing a sudden strike, one designed not just to deter, but to topple Iran's government and replace it with a pro-U.S. leadership that would sever the entire axis China has built for years. And if that happens, hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese investment in Iran could be wiped out overnight. In modern conflict, you don't have to announce we're protecting Iran. You just have to appear in the right place, at the right time, in the right formation. A naval group moving into sensitive waters, backed by escorts, replenishment ships, amphibious assets, helicopters. On the surface, it looks like coordination drills. But in strategic terms, it means something else. Beijing is placing its people and hardware exactly where the U.S. would want to strike. And from the moment Chinese ships and personnel are physically present, every fast decapitation plan in Washington changes. A strike on Iran is no longer hitting an isolated sanctioned state. It becomes striking inside a space where China is present. And that's the most elegant form of deterrence today. You don't need to fire. You just raise the risk until the other side has to ask, if we hit, what happens if we accidentally touch China? A collision at sea, a radar lock, a drone falling in the wrong place, a warning shot that goes 1 second too far. One accident is enough to transform an Iran crisis into a direct U.S.-China escalation risk. And markets don't wait for diplomats to explain accidents. They price fear instantly. So why is China willing to take this risk? Because Iran isn't just a partner. Iran is an energy valve. Discounted oil isn't just gasoline. It's electricity for factories, feedstock for chemicals and plastics, fuel for shipping and logistics, and most importantly, the base cost of China's export machine. If China can keep that discounted flow for years, it doesn't need miracles. It just needs time. Because the superpower contest isn't only about aircraft carriers, it's about a brutal, simple question. Who can produce cheaper, longer, and more sustainably? Washington understands that, which is exactly why it has a motive to break this pipeline, by forcing political change in Tehran. But Beijing understands it too, and that's why it builds a shield. Inside Iran, pressure is already peaking. Inflation is biting, sanctions are choking trade, the currency is under strain, social tension is rising, and instability can erupt at any moment. This is what makes a sudden strike scenario so dangerous. When a system is weakened internally, sometimes one push in the right place triggers a domino collapse. If Washington believes it can exploit internal fractures to engineer regime change, China reads that as a direct threat to its assets and its strategic position. Because for Beijing, Iran isn't just about oil. It's a regional foothold, a logistics corridor, and a pressure point that prevents the U.S. from monopolizing control over the world's energy throat. And here's the core problem for Washington. Striking Iran can boomerang straight back into the American economy. On paper, it sounds simple. Hit hard, reshape the political order. But Iran sits next to Hormuz, the global oil choke point. In reality, you don't need Hormuz to be fully shut down. You only need fear that it could become a war zone to spike insurance, raise freight costs, increase risk premiums, and send oil prices jumping. And when oil jumps, the U.S. absorbs 3 immediate political and economic shocks. First, inflation returns. Gas prices are felt instantly, and they spread into transport, food, logistics, and consumer goods. A foreign war becomes a domestic rage cycle at the pump and the grocery store. Second, rate cuts die. If inflation reaccelerates, the central bank can't ease. Credit stays expensive, businesses tighten, housing suffers, consumption weakens. Third, borrowing costs rise. American state power depends on borrowing cheaply, but hotter inflation pushes yields up and makes debt service heavier. So every military decision stops being just a battlefield decision. It becomes a budget burn decision. In other words, America can win abroad and still lose at the gas station. That's the trap. Hit hard and oil spikes, inflation spikes, domestic politics explode. Don't hit, and China keeps a discounted energy stream, giving its industry a structural edge that compounds over years. And if the U.S. pressures Iran but fails to topple the regime, the discounted flow continues through back channels, shadow logistics, and rerouted trade. Iran survives, and China gains what every industrial power wants in a fragmented world, a cheaper, steadier energy base than its rivals. In a decade-long cost war, that's like earning points every day. Cheaper output, stronger margins, more resilience, greater ability to undercut competitors. And the U.S. discovers an ugly reality. You can sanction a country, but when a peer power physically anchors itself to keep the valve open, sanctions decay. The harder you squeeze, the more the target learns to root around you. So the truly frightening thing right now isn't when the missiles fly. It's that China has placed a piece on the board that changes the rules and constrains American options. Washington is staring at a decision tree where every branch hurts. Escalate and risk an oil shock that reignites inflation and political backlash, hold back and allow China to keep an industrial subsidy embedded in geopolitics, or tighten pressure and accelerate the creation of evasive networks that dull America's weapon over time. And while the U.S. debates strike or not, China only has to do one thing: keep the energy valve open. Now zoom into Washington's real battlefield, because in this scenario the most dangerous front isn't Tehran, and it isn't even the Strait of Hormuz. It's the American economy and the domestic pain threshold that decides what the U.S. can and cannot do. Start with the first layer: the energy shock that turns foreign policy into inflation. People talk about closing Hormuz like it's a binary switch, but markets don't need an actual shutdown to panic. They only need uncertainty. The moment shipping lanes feel like they might become a war zone, insurers reprice risk, freight rates climb, and refiners bid up crude just in case. That just in case is enough to push oil higher fast, because oil is not merely a commodity, it's a benchmark for fear. And when oil rises, everything rises with it. Gasoline, trucking, food, plastics, chemicals, airline tickets, household goods, construction inputs, and the entire logistics stack that holds a consumption economy together. This is where the United States is uniquely vulnerable. Not because it lacks resources, but because it is politically wired to react violently to cost-of-living shocks. You can win battles overseas and still lose control at home if the price of victory shows up at the pump. 1/4 of visibly higher gasoline prices can become a national narrative of betrayal. Why are we paying for another war? That narrative doesn't care about strategy. It cares about receipts. And when inflation flares, the second layer kicks in. Monetary policy gets trapped. If prices re-accelerate, rate cuts die. Credit stays expensive. Mortgages stay brutal. Corporate refinancing gets harder. Consumer confidence breaks. Business investment slows. The mood turns sour. And when the mood turns sour in the U.S., politics doesn't calm down. It polarizes and detonates. That is the first American crisis inside an Iran escalation. The U.S. is powerful enough to create shocks, but not politically insulated enough to absorb them calmly. Now the third layer makes it even darker: debt and financial fragility. American state power depends on the ability to borrow cheaply and continuously, because global markets still treat U.S. debt as the closest thing to a safe asset. But that privilege is not magic. It depends on stability and inflation being contained. If an Iran crisis reignites inflation, yields rise, borrowing becomes more expensive, and suddenly the U.S. isn't just funding an overseas operation, it's funding it in an environment where every extra dollar carries a heavier interest burden. The contradiction becomes ugly. The more Washington tries to project power to preserve its system, the more it inflates the cost of maintaining that system. This is how empires get squeezed in the modern era, not by a single missile, but by the slow math of financing. And here is where China's move becomes truly strategic. Beijing doesn't need to defeat the U.S. Navy in open conflict. It only needs to make the U.S. choose between external dominance and internal stability. Now zoom out to the industrial layer, the silent one that doesn't trend for a week but decides the next decade. Manufacturing is a cost war. If China can consistently secure cheaper energy inputs through a discounted supply line, it doesn't just help a few refineries. It cascades through the entire industrial stack. Cheaper feedstock means cheaper chemicals, cheaper plastics, cheaper industrial heat, cheaper shipping fuel, cheaper electricity in energy-intensive regions, and ultimately cheaper output across sectors where margins are thin. People think superpower competition is about carriers and stealth bombers. The deeper competition is about who can produce at scale without choking on costs. If Iran's discounted oil keeps flowing to China, Beijing gains a quiet stabilizer at the exact moment the world fragments into blocks. It's not just oil, it's resilience. It's the ability to keep factories running when others slow down. And for Washington, that is a strategic nightmare because the U.S. is already struggling with industrial hollowing, supply chain insecurity, and the political trauma of manufacturing job losses. Reshoring sounds patriotic until voters feel the price tag. You can't reshore at a premium and expect applause when living costs rise. You can subsidize, yes, but subsidies are fiscal pressure, and fiscal pressure in an inflationary environment is political suicide. That's the cruel loop. The policies needed to rebuild industry often raise costs in the short term, but American politics punishes short-term pain. So the U.S. gets trapped between economic logic and electoral logic, between what is strategically necessary and what is politically survivable. Now add the alliance layer, because America never fights alone in theory, but allies are not machines, they're governments with voters. If an Iran crisis spikes energy prices globally, partners in Europe and Asia start doing what they always do under stress. They hedge. Some will publicly support Washington while quietly searching for carve-outs, exemptions, alternative suppliers, and diplomatic off-ramps. Others will push back against escalation because their cabinets cannot survive domestic protests over energy bills and recession risk. And every sign of hesitation signals to markets and rivals that American control is weaker than advertised. In a system-level contest, perception is part of power. If the U.S. looks unable to impose order without destabilizing its own coalition, rivals gain room to maneuver. That leads to the sanctions layer, the weapon Washington loves because it looks like control without casualties. But sanctions only work when the target is isolated and when third parties fear punishment more than they value the relationship. In this scenario, China's physical presence around Iran changes the psychology. It signals that Iran is no longer alone and that a major power is willing to absorb costs to keep the valve open. That makes sanctions harder to enforce and easier to evade. The harder the U.S. pushes, the more sophisticated evasion networks become. Shadow shipping, reflagging, intermediaries, barter-style swaps, alternative insurance, discount trades, backdoor refining, indirect payment channels. And the more the world practices evasion, the less frightening the sanctions threat becomes over time. That is, leverage decay, slow, corrosive, and cumulative. The U.S. can still punish, but punishment becomes expensive, noisy, and less reliable as more actors learn to route around it. And here is the strategic nightmare hidden underneath all of this. Washington can't easily stop the decay without escalating into force, because financial tools are no longer enough when a peer competitor is willing to underwrite the target's survival. So the U.S. faces the worst choice imaginable: accept a slow industrial disadvantage while China compounds cost advantages, or gamble on an action that could spike oil, reignite inflation, keep rates higher for longer, raise debt service costs, fracture alliances, and trigger domestic political rupture. Either way, the U.S. pays in money, stability, credibility, or all three at once. This is why China's exercise is not just theater. It is a weapon aimed at America's internal constraints. It exploits a truth few people say out loud. The United States may still have the strongest military on earth, but it no longer has unlimited economic and political room to absorb the consequences the way it once did. And now the crisis becomes a countdown not only over Tehran, but over Washington's own tolerance. Because once the decision-makers realize that every path leads to domestic pain, the question inside the war room stops being, "Can we do it?" and becomes, "Can we afford what happens after we do?" In Part 3, we go to the end game: how China can turn Iran into a long-term pressure point without firing a shot, how maximum pressure can backfire into maximum fragmentation, and why the most dangerous outcome isn't a clean U.S.-China war, but a world where Washington keeps escalating coercion to prove it still rules, and accidentally accelerates the breakdown of the very system that once made its power feel effortless. China doesn't have to win in Iran the old imperial way by conquering territory or planting a flag. In this endgame, China only needs Iran to remain functional enough to keep the discounted energy valve open, and to turn that valve into a permanent pressure point on the United States. That is why the naval deployment matters. It's not designed for a glorious battle. It's designed to create a new physical fact on the water and near critical nodes. Chinese ships, Chinese personnel, Chinese interests, all present inside the very space where Washington once enjoyed clean, one-sided coercion. Once that fact exists, the U.S. loses the luxury of simple options. Every strike becomes a two-target problem: Iran and escalation itself. And escalation in Hormuz is the one thing the U.S. cannot absorb without risking the domestic inflation spiral and political rupture we just laid out. This is how a peer competitor fights a superpower in the modern era, not by defeating it outright, but by making its choices politically toxic, economically destabilizing, and strategically self-defeating. Now watch how the pressure campaign plays out over months, not days. Step 1 is stabilizing the oil corridor, not with treaties, but with presence. China signals that it can escort what matters, ensure what matters through alternative channels, and absorb enough marginal risk to keep flows moving. Even if Beijing only reduces the fear premium at the margin, that margin can be the difference between stable shipping and panic. Step 2 is institutionalizing the discount so it becomes structural, not temporary. Long contracts, flexible shipping, intermediaries, barter-style swaps, alternative insurance, refineries tuned to that grade, payment channels designed to minimize exposure to enforcement. The public sees crude trade. The system sees something else, an industrial subsidy embedded inside geopolitics. Step 3 is multiplying escape routes, because redundancy is the antidote to sanctions. The harder Washington squeezes, the more Beijing invests in bypass logistics, shadow fleets, backdoor refining, reflagging networks, and payment workarounds. This is the ugly secret of modern economic warfare. pressure doesn't always stop flows. It often fragments them, routes them, and makes them harder to trace. And every successful workaround teaches the world a lesson. You can survive without asking Washington for permission. That lesson is corrosive to U.S. power, because America's strongest weapon isn't just its navy. It's compliance. The U.S. wins when the world believes it must comply. When enough players learn to function without complying, American leverage doesn't collapse overnight, but it becomes expensive, noisy, and less reliable. That's leverage decay in real time. Now look at Washington's decision tree in this endgame and why each branch tilts pessimistic. Option 1 is escalation. The U.S. decides it must break the China-Iran energy link by force. Strikes on infrastructure, blockade posture, decapitation operations, or engineered regime collapse. But China's physical presence raises the chance of direct confrontation or accidental contact. And direct confrontation in Hormuz is a nightmare for the American economy. The result isn't a neat victory. It's a risk spiral. Oil spikes, inflation reignites, rate cuts vanish, yields climb, debt service costs rise, consumer confidence cracks, and political rage accelerates. The U.S. can be militarily dominant and still become strategically weaker because the cost of action erodes stability at home. That is the imperial paradox. External strength generates internal fragility. Option 2 is maximum pressure without war. Sanctions, seizures, secondary penalties, financial threats, diplomatic isolation. It looks cleaner, but it carries a different poison. With China committed and physically anchored, pressure becomes a grinding contest of evasion and enforcement. The U.S. spends more intelligence resources, more diplomatic bandwidth, more political capital just to slow a flow that never fully stops. And each round of enforcement that fails to stop it teaches the world another corrosive lesson. Washington can punish, but Washington cannot fully control. That shifts behavior globally. Allies start hedging harder. Neutrals start testing boundaries. Partners demand exemptions. In other words, maximum pressure can morph into maximum fragmentation, where the system splinters into workaround networks precisely because everyone is trying to avoid being the next target. Option 3 is restraint. The U.S. avoids escalation to protect its domestic economy and focuses on other theaters. This is the quietest option and politically the easiest in a society exhausted by costs, but it produces the slowest defeat. Iran stays inside China's orbit. The discount persists. The industrial advantage compounds quietly for years. The U.S. learns it cannot easily cut a strategic energy artery when a peer competitor is willing to stand inside the choke point and defend the valve. That outcome won't look like collapse in a headline. It will look like a decade of drift, harder reshoring, more subsidies, more debt, more polarization, and a foreign policy that feels increasingly reactive rather than commanding. So when people ask what the most dangerous outcome is, it's not necessarily a clean U.S.-China shooting war. The most dangerous outcome is a world where Washington keeps escalating coercion to prove it still rules, and in doing so accelerates the breakdown of the rules that once made its power feel effortless. Because American power has always depended on a paradox. The U.S. can act globally because the system it leads makes those actions relatively cheap. If that system fractures into rival networks of payment, shipping, insurance, energy trade, and logistics, then U.S. power becomes more expensive to use. Every sanction requires more enforcement. Every intervention costs more. Every coalition requires more side payments and concessions. And when power becomes expensive, democracies turn inward. They demand domestic spending. They punish foreign entanglements. They elect leaders who promise either withdrawal or shock escalation. but never the slow maintenance a stable system actually needs. This is how superpowers become unstable, not from one decisive defeat, but from overextension into a world that no longer wants to be managed. In this scenario, China understands the psychological weakness at the heart of the American model. Americans will tolerate many things, but they will not tolerate sustained cost of living pain without political revolt. So China's posture around Iran is not only a shield for Tehran, it's a lever placed directly on America's inflation nerve. The more Washington pushes against that lever, the more it risks triggering domestic backlash that makes consistent long-term strategy impossible. That is why this story is bleak. It suggests the United States is entering an era where it can still intimidate, still punish, still strike, but cannot easily produce stable outcomes without destabilizing itself. Meanwhile, China is practicing a different kind of power. Power that doesn't need speeches, only supply lines. Power that doesn't need moral narratives, only cost advantages. Power that doesn't need to win the argument, only to keep the factories running. Bring it back to the opening image. Chinese warships near Hormuz, a government in Tehran under pressure, and Washington staring at a decision tree where every branch leads to pain. That is the real message. Not that America is suddenly weak, but that the structure of the world has changed in a way that makes American strength less clean, less decisive, and more self-damaging. Iran becomes a mirror reflecting the limits of coercion in a multipolar system, the limits of sanctions against a determined peer, and the limits of empire in a society that can't absorb shocks the way it once did. So here is the final takeaway. The deployment is not the start of a war. It is the start of a new equation, one where the U.S. can no longer assume it can cut off rivals by controlling choke points, because rivals are now willing to stand inside those choke points and make every action expensive. And the most frightening possibility in that equation isn't that China wins outright, it's that America keeps trying to prove it still rules, and the effort to prove it accelerates the unraveling of the very system that once made its power feel effortless.